Okay, so welcome to ACT and welcome to the program in art, culture, and technology. That's what ACT stands for. The lecture series. And this is the last of this particular series that's focusing on cinematic migrations, experiments in thinking, action, and form. My name is Renee Green. I'm an artist, writer, filmmaker, and also professor and current head of the program. Tonight is our last lecture of the season also, and it's also the last, well, I think there's one more public event that ACT is going to have in May, a sound event. But it's the last event of the lecture series. And the series began, this particular one, Cinematic Migrations, began in 2012 in conjunction with a 2-year residency of the filmmaker, Jana Kamfra, and the producer, Lena Gopal, from Smoking Dog Films in London. And this was in conjunction with the Visiting Artist Program, which is now under the umbrella of CAST. Before I introduce tonight's guest, I'd like to acknowledge and thank the invisible but essential participants in making the lecture series and all related ACT public programs possible. I thank Madeline Gallagher, our media associate, who has gone beyond her duty to accommodate all of the guests' diverse and complex media needs. I'd like to also thank Marion Cunningham, ACT's academic assistant, Val. Marion Cunningham is the academic thank you, officer, and also Andrew Barossi, financial assistant. Despite their being relatively invisible to you, they have made it possible that we could gather here on the different Mondays that we have. And lastly, I'd like to thank Laura Kiki-san, our public programs coordinator and in-house designer. Laura's commitment to make our guests' visits a memorable experience has proven successful, as our visitors never tire of reminding me how gracious she's been in hosting them. She's been responsible also for the enticing visual identity of this project, for creating the posters, and all kinds of facets related to this series. And it's been a pleasure to work with her during these years. And actually, lastly, I'd like to thank for the documentation for the duration of the lecture series, Andrew Newman, who also, the documentation is also posted online, so you can check what's been taking place there as well. And so Cinematic Migrations is my research project, and it will continue, although it will resume in spring 2015 as a seminar as well as production workshops. And perhaps in the future there will be more public events. We will see. But today marks the public closure of this particular series. And I look forward to working with all of you again, and I thank you, the public, and the guests for having been so supportive and having been participants. And so now I'd like to turn to this evening's guest, Elvan Zabunyan. I welcome with great fondness Elvan Zabunyan. I had the pleasure of meeting Elvan almost 20 years ago, which is kind of shocking to think about how long ago, how the time flies, at a conference in London at the ICA, and it was focusing on Frantz Fanon. Since then, it's been remarkable to encounter her energy and her probing intellect, and to observe the complexity with which she's examining different areas of contemporary art, which are important yet have been obscured. Elvan Zabunyan is a contemporary art historian and art critic based in Paris. Her research focuses on the redefinition of contemporary art history through post-colonial and feminist art and theory in the context of the genealogy of cultural displacement. She is the author of Black is a Color, a history of contemporary African-American art. It was published in 2005. And also, just last year, the publication of Theresa Hak Kyung Cha, Berkeley, 1968. Her essays on contemporary visual arts have appeared in books, exhibition catalogues, and journals. She is an associate professor at the Rennes University in Brittany, in France, and director of the Curatorial Program in the Art History Department. The starting point of Elvan Zabunyan's talk is the work of Korea-born American artist and poet Theresa Hak Kyung Cha. In 1980, having left her native Korea 17 years earlier, Cha returned to work on a film project she described as, quote, memory that materializes directly on the screen. Cha was fluent in English, French, and Korean, and worked with words as images and with images as words, using the structure of language and translation to create a multiplicity of narratives in time, space, and memory. And so the title of this evening's presentation is Theresa Hak Kyung Cha, Translations of Memory. I welcome Elvan Zabunyan.
Thank you, Renee Green, for this invitation. I'm very pleased to be here. And I would also like to thank you. You've thanked all the people I wanted to thank, but I was very happy to be in contact with Laura and Andrew and Madeleine this last month. They were very helpful in all the exchanges we had. And I would also like to thank Javier Anguera and Thierry Lefebvre and all of you for being here tonight. So I hope this, let's see, we tried all the technical things for, like, I put it here. Sorry about that. So where is my, doesn't work. Where is it? Okay, you have to help me with that. Anyway, several weeks ago, because I wanted to present the image, so where is it? Okay, thank you. Thank you. So several weeks ago, when I have received information regarding Yvonne's Reiner talk, I realized that the image which was chosen for the lecture series was this one of Theresa Hak Kyung Cha you have on the screen. And then the poster shows this one. Aveugle Voix was a performance Theresa Hak Kyung Cha did in 1975 on October 22nd at 63 Bloxham Street in San Francisco. Aveugle means blind in French, and voix means voice, but voir means also to see. So we can therefore read aveugle voix as blind sees, or the blind who sees. That same year, Michel Foucault and Hélène Cixous have a conversation on Marguerite Duras. They focus on the importance of memory for this major figure of French literature, and they also evoke her writings as visual works. Michel Foucault points on a beautiful idea he sees in Duras' work, which is a memory without souvenir. This memory, says Foucault, quote, is like a memory which is a veil of mist, a memory which refers constantly to memory, a memory on memory, but a memory which erases all souvenir, end of quote. He goes on interrogating how this work of literature could suddenly be displaced in film and produce a work of cinema, which, he emphasizes, is as important as the work of literature. For Cixous, this becomes possible by Marguerite Duras' powerful use of the look. A little further in the conversation, she says, quote, Marguerite Duras is someone who has an extremely powerful subconscious. She is a blind, and this always struck me. She is a blind who, I think, sees. Michel Foucault approves this and as an absolute truth, and he then says, quote, Marguerite Duras is blind almost in the technical way, as her sense of touch creates visibility, as the blind sees with his or her sense of touch. What he or she touches produces that which is visible. Theresa Hak Kyung Cha knew well Marguerite Duras, both literature and films. She kept in her archive different material on the French writer and filmmaker. But she could not have the knowledge of this conversation between Michel Foucault and Hélène Cixous when she decided to do her performance Aveugle Voix, as the conversation was published in a French journal precisely in October of the year 1975, so exactly at the same moment Cha did her performance. This very interesting coincidence I wanted to mention here to begin my presentation this evening is one of a number I have experienced through the research I have done on Cha these last years. It is because of the interplay between different artistic, literary, and critical voices that I started this work on Theresa Hak Kyung Cha, whose production I had the chance to discover thanks to the collection at the Berkeley Art Museum Pacific Film Archive, where the archives, which were given to the museum by her family 10 years after her tragic death in New York in 1982, Cha was raped and murdered. These different voices were one of the reasons why this work, which is embracing different forms and mediums, performance, film, video, poetry, research, mail art, seemed to me so important, even though it stayed so confidential within the mainstream Western art history. I would like to present through the work of this artist the way another form of history of art could be written, a history of art which could be defined as in echoes. Here's one poem which could be the second start of the lecture and which I will take as a connected thread to develop my approach of this conceptual and poetic work. You have it on the screen, Echo, this is from Cha. The in-between time from when a sound is made to when it returns as an echo. No one knows if it was heard, when it was heard, when it would be heard, if ever at all. But it continues on and on and on, maybe 1,000 years. Someone's memory, tale, legend, poem, dream. Well before the many theories raising the question of multiculturalism had taken root in the US art world of the early 1990s, we have the figure of Theresa Hak Kyung Cha. In considering her work, we need to understand at what point the notions of displacement and shift of origin, of memory, as much individual as collective, had marked her existence and, as a consequence, her work. Everything with Cha that goes in the direction of visual, literary, and conceptual reflection finds its point of departure in her Korean identity, which has imposed a constant back and forth on her based on the expressions, discourse, and chosen media, with at the center of her practice, language itself. Theresa Hak Kyung Cha's family arrived in the Bay Area in 1963 after having spent 1 year in Hawaii. In San Francisco, between 1964 and 1968, all the Cha children were enrolled in Catholic school. She and her sister Elizabeth attended the convent of the Sacred Heart in San Francisco, where they learned French. Theresa Hak Kyung Cha sung in the chor and studied Greek and Latin. There again, the learning of foreign languages formed a part of her education and by extension had an effect on her artistic creation. In a statement she proposed for the preamble of her film project White Dust from Mongolia in 1980, Cha wrote, quote, "As a foreigner, learning a new language extended beyond its basic function of communication as it is generally for a native speaker, to a continuously imposed detachment that allowed analysis and experimentation with other relationship of language. My video, film, and performance works has been always concerned with these problems. There are explorations of language structures inherent in written and spoken material, photographic and filmic images, the creation of new relationships and meanings in the simultaneity of these forms." End of quote. In 1978, Theresa Hak Kyung Cha produced a video installation which was exhibited several times during her lifetime. At the Passage Paysage, the title is Passage Paysage. It was exhibited at the University Art Museum of Berkeley in 1978, at the San Francisco Art Institute in 1979, and at the Kitchen Center for Video and Music in New York in 1982. And after her death, in two major feminist exhibitions, Differences on Representation and Sexuality at the New Museum of New York in 1984, and the Visible at the Institute of Contemporary Art of Boston in 1996. Passage Paysage is an especially important work because it validates a particularly innovative concept for the period, as it reconciles numerous aesthetic questions that affect artistic practice and associates itself with a work of memory in synthesizing different time strata, memory that she transmits in layers like episodes, both geological and genealogical. The work is also important because it concludes a 10-year period of study culminating with Cha's obtaining a Master of Fine Arts in spring of 1978 from UC Berkeley. Passage Paysage is made up of 3 video monitors that present 3 distinct tapes, each one 10 minutes long. Hundreds of images with no synchronization are presented simultaneously on the 3 monitors. The artist's voice speaks words that sometimes are superimposed, other times barely audible because of a deliberate slowing of the soundtrack. The words therefore become suddenly mournful. Sometimes they are whispered with the smallest breath. You can hear, "Not gone, not yet, not gone yet, a few remaining moments. It should be as good as gone, gone, but still remaining moments yet, wait, what waits, where and when." These words, which resounds like an incantation when they are read, recall certain forms of Samuel Beckett's writing, notably this manner in which repetition and punctuation produce an apnea-like phenomenon with the reading. The voice of Theresa Hak Kyung Cha accompanies the images that you see on the 3 screens: landscapes, rooms, an unmade bed, Cha as a child, her hands opening and closing, piles of letters joined by a thread, a lighted candle that someone extinguished, and words in French and English. This montage that had been designed in an elliptical form emphasizes the effort of remembering. The effects of fading and the dissolving of the images represent those vestiges of memory that are lost and then found. In the document that Cha produced to accompany her installation, she defines more closely the meaning that she hopes to convey with this work. She thinks of it as a narrative issuing from her memory, as passage, the word conveying to her the meaning of road or path, something physical and geographical, spatial, but which functions equally as a metaphor, mixing French and English. She writes, retrouver les passages, which means to find again the passages of memory, to unconscious, collective, personal memory. She insists on the function of the images and of the space in time that separates them. She maintains that she wants to find a form and a process that represents the way memory really functions. You can read on the screen, appearance of an image, sound and fade, misogushi, dissolve with water. The final part of the text of her presentation recalls the pays, which is country, homeland in French, referring to past ancient ancestry. You have pays, paysage, paysage dans le paysage, mon paysage, paysage de la mémoire, which means a country, landscape, landscape in the country, my country, landscape of memory. The name of the famous Japanese filmmaker, Kenji Mizoguchi, is not here by hazard, as he is certainly one of the masters for this notion of dissolving with water, as this element is a major and very symbolic one in his films. Water is at the center of displacement and migration, both in reality and in allegory. The subtitle Cha placed beneath her main title appeared to passage paysage, son, image, son, image. The repetition of son, image, which are French words, son, image, and the carefully masterful way it was done in this installation in particular, and in her work in general, touches on a question that recurs in contemporary practice, whether associated with contemporary art or with cinema. The relationship of sound, son, to image, image, or son, image, sound, image, retakes the name Jean-Luc Godard gave the workshop he created in 1974 with Anne-Marie Miéville. The filmmaker elaborated this concept during the 1970s because of video, which became like a laboratory for experimenting with image, and through the image he saw it as his cinema. In fact, video was not so much for him a period, the video years, as a way of being in general, a way to look and to think that functioned continuously and directly with regard to each thing. We can borrow this idea to apply it to Cha's practice when she uses video and moving image, especially in passage paysage. In French, son, image also means his or her image. And in Godard's film, Numéro 2, his first and most radical experience with video, which I will present a short clip now, you will be able to see this place of word.
Il avait ça. un paysage et dedans on met une usine.
C'est comme si je disais qu'à Marseille, en ce moment, et plus généralement dans le bâtiment, c'est une chose facile.
C'est comme si je disais qu'à Ronpoulin, en ce moment, et plus généralement dans l'industrie chimique, les femmes, on leur doit bouffer aux acides.
Il y avait ça, il y avait une usine et tout autour on avait un paysage.
Quand il lit le papier, là, les délégués, ils lisent le papier des autres pour s'en souvenir, mais je crois que c'est le papier qui commande, puis c'est ça qui va pas. Tu te souviens de Machin, je crois, il est au State Department à Washington maintenant. Puis Machin, je sais pas, je crois qu'il a fini consul à Jakarta. Puis Machin, la dernière fois qu'on l'a vu, c'était dans une manif à Toulouse, et puis il y a eu les flics, on l'a plus revu. Ben, tu vois ici, je sais pas, c'est quand même simple. C'est simple parce qu'il n'y a plus de machin, il n'y a que des machines. Machin, machine, tu vois. Moi, machin, ben, relation avec une machine, puis homme, femme, machin, machine. C'est quoi ici, tu demandes? Ben, c'est une bibliothèque. Ben, alors où ils sont les bouquins? Ben, il n'y a pas de bouquins parce que c'est une imprimerie. On imprime. On n'imprime pas du papier. Du papier. Tu sais, c'est comme ça qu'on appelle l'argent, les traites qui circulent entre les banques. On appelle ça faire du papier. Mais ici, on ne fait pas de papier. Pourtant, on imprime. Alors qu'une imprimerie, non, c'est pas une imprimerie parce qu'on lit les livres, on lit, etc. Je sais pas si, en biologie, tu vois, c'est une usine ici. On pourrait dire que c'est une usine. Ben, le corps, c'est une usine. Mais ici, c'est une usine, tu vois. J'écoute la machine. Toi, la machine va plus vite. T'entends? Puis la machine, elle va moins vite. Et moi, je suis le patron, mais je suis le patron, je suis un patron spécial parce que je suis l'ouvrier aussi. Et c'est parce que je suis pas seul qu'en tant qu'ouvrier, on a pris le pouvoir. Les autres, ben, j'en parlerai, ils sont là, ils travaillent. Et j'écoute le bruit de l'usine. J'étais malade longtemps, puis ça m'a fait penser à l'usine. Je dirais qu'ici, tu vois, ce qui va pas, c'est qu'il y a...
So the numéro 2 is 1 hour and 23 minutes. So I just presented 5 minutes of it. So so you have, yeah, I had some images in case it doesn't work with the film. The influence of Godard, who visited Berkeley several times at the moment Cha was studying there. She also had a student job at the Pacific Film Archive, which allowed her to see a huge number of avant-garde cinema. And the importance of the linguistic content and of the semiology of film, as well as a signal influence on the aesthetic and theoretical transformation of the 1970s, are echoed in the work of Theresa Hak Kyung Cha. She also immersed herself in film theory during her entire 8-month stay in Paris that began in January 1976. There, she studied at the Centre d'études américaines du cinéma, which is the Center for American Studies of Film, where she took courses from Raymond Bellour, Christian Metz, and Thierry Kunsel. It was there that she broadened her knowledge of cinema history and where she adopted the theories that were coming to the surface in Paris, London, and California at that time. All of which led to the US publication of her first anthology of essays entitled Apparatus, 1980, a series of essays on the interrogations inherent in the display of cinematography, as much from the technical point of view as from the conceptual. Her constant use of language that reflects emptiness, absence, disappearance, as if she were deciding to use half the symbol not there to create a space of otherness, becomes that which structures her writing, whether poetic or visual. When we look at the artist's biographical sketch, placing it in parallel with the different stages that produced breaks or particle links up in her artistic work, we observe that a major event profoundly modified the relationship that she established with her own identity, although not necessarily the structure, which maintained a certain constancy with her hybridity. It concerned a trip to Korea that she made with her brother John in 1979, 16 years after she had left her country. This moment clearly marks a return to a subjectivity which was always present in her performances and in her videos, but with the difference that here, the affirmation of a form of nostalgia, of a Heimat, like native land, claimed, of a memory found again, considerably changed the way in which she engaged in reflection. With the production of two texts, conjoined like Siamese twins, an unfinished film project and a book that reveals her and today reaffirms her uniqueness, she built the very foundation of her work during these 2 years that would be the last of her life. This notion of, this Deleuzian notion of deterritorialization, often refrained in the critical discourse on contemporary art when it's a matter of concepts pertaining to practices outside official pathways, takes on a particular value when we link it to the relationship that Cha established with the cultural displacement that was hers. This personal affair that depends on a cramped space and which touches on the most intimate forms of subjectivity was expressed in the conscience of this other history that was twisted within her. This history was reconstituted from the snippets of memory that she passed it back together, that she assembled and disassembled, like in Passage Paysage. From this memory without souvenir, which Michel Foucault and Hélène Cixous said of Marguerite Duras, from whom Cha, ever the archaeologist, was going to reconstruct the different strata. Passage Paysage heralded with the question of a recollection that held fast to images and sounds, a different manner of thinking about the past and of making it re-emerge. From 1979, and especially from 1980, what Theresa Hak Kyung Cha injected into her visual expression and writing removed her even further from the possibility of being captured by the usual tools of the history of art, cinema, or literature. We can say that Cha was in a certain way at the avant-garde of the analytical processes that were based on the postcolonial problematic, as such might be understood today, and with what this implies for a change of paradigm in the reading of visual or literary works. For Godard, video was a way to breathe with images, suggests the French film theorist Philippe Dubois. This notion of breathing is often visible in Cha's work linked to language. We can see it in her book Dictée, and which is a book both in French and in English. And so the pages will the pages present like the left page in French and the right page in English. On this one, you can read, "Not possible to distinguish," this quote, "the speech exhalate, affirmed in exhalation, exclaimed in inhalation, to distinguish no more the rain from dreams or from breaths." One page after, you can read, "To bite the tongue, swallow, deep, deeper, swallow, again, even more, just until there would be no more of organ no more, cries." Or again, "Years and years, 10 upon 10, 100 upon 100 years after, no longer possible to distinguish the audible, signs, spoken, memory, which was already said to be, said just to say will, say going to just say, memory not all heard, not certain, rain dreams the sound, the pauses, exhalation, affirmation, all affirmations in exhalation, little by little. There, then, years after, uncertain if the rain, the speaking, remembered how it has been, as it had been, if it had been. No organ anymore cries, void the words, void the silence. And one of her video, Mouse to Mouse, which I would like to present also a clip now, is also connected to this urge to draw air deep into the lungs in order to hold the breath. It is also very much referring to water. In the previous verses, the rain is present. And there is an interesting superposition of the video image as an aquatic texture. Mouse to Mouse was realized in 1975, the same year Jean-Luc Godard and Marie Miéville did Numéro 2. So here's now the clip. It will be like about 4-5 minutes. just presented a few minutes. The video is 8 minutes long, so it goes on like this with silence and sound, but just like this, the sound of the video, which is like water. Mouth to mouth could also be thought as an interstice, a passage where the open mouth is both a screen, a gate, a projection, a space which swallows, which emphasizes silence, but at the same time which calls and recalls language, sound and images, but also silent words and silent images. This is a point which is also often visible in her performances. For example, in Réveillé dans la brume, again a French title, which means awaking in the mist, which was performed in October 1977 in San Francisco in a series of events organized by Judith Berry. A slide projection on a wall of an empty space presents words which belong to a same family of meaning, both in a real and in a metaphorical way. You therefore see that Cha connects mouth with porch, portal, portico. As language is the question of country, of origin, is a recurrent theme in Cha's work, what is produced in the artist's work from the moment of her trip to Korea is a very important event that resulted in a lightening of her creative process. The artist seems to thus rid herself of the obligatory references that had educated her in order to turn toward an expression that, while remaining faithful to them, articulates heterogeneous elements without letting go of her basis and without turning them into mere mechanical forms. These elements, always made up of words, images, sounds, become unconscious of their liberty and use it to build a broader relationship with history, memory, and both visual and written representation. The stretching that is produced lies both spatially and virtually within the geographic and temporal distance that separates the United States from Korea, like the watch that accentuates the time lag between the two countries in her text, Temps Mort. You have it on the screen. She tells me that it was 16 hours from here ahead. Ahead of this time, she says. It is 4:30 p.m. here. It is 8:30 a.m. there. The next day. We could say that even if her earlier works, like Father, Mother, or Chronology, both dating from 1977, evoke the recollection of family by presenting portraits of her parents and of her brothers and sisters in a treatment that mixes superimposition and erasure. It is really from 1978 when Passage Paysage was produced and where she has inserted a photo of herself as a child that a change takes place. She is able to effect a return to the past while keeping the consciousness of history that her origins have determined, not just for her, but also in the political and cultural configuration of transnational exchanges. In another work that also dates from 1978, titled Photo Essay, she presents photographs, several from the San Francisco High School she attended from September 1965 to June 1969, completed by text that relate past moments like bits of drawn memory that one would seek to bring up to the surface of the water. On the screen you can see the page where she mentions arrival August 31st, 1962, United States. And one can read the most astonishing of the first day was the abundance, wealth, the excess. In her presentation of this project, she writes, quote, "This photographic essay is documentation, a recording of events that have occurred in the past. The places photographed are actually existing places of these events, except for the French souvenir, which exist in an imaginary space that I have tried to locate physically to identify and name in the represented image. The temporal and spatial value in the represented image seems to introduce a different orientation and meaning for me. I hope to continue in developing further these ideas. End of quote. That same year, in 1978, she performs at the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art one of her very important work, which could again emphasizes this temporal and spatial value in images. But here, she is playing directly in front of a screen, of a slide projection, which can be read both as a screen and a set. With other things seen, other things heard, her experience in Paris, through her classes in film and film theory, made her even more aware of a history with which she intervenes. The desire to tie the space to time and the past to the present, to think about herself in both temporalities and to perform in front of an empty cinema screen is a way for her to refer to void and to silence. These two are constantly present in her visual and written works. But this temporality is almost thought as jet lag, and this is even more precisely represented after the experience of returning to Korea. It is clear in her text, also exilés, temps morts, which are linked conceptually and physically. I have this, the book which was published by the California Press, that Cha has forcefully synthesized this experience of returning to her country of birth. The texts were published for the first time in Hotel, the work that her friend Rhys Williams edited in 1980. It was from the point of this trip, her return, that she became aware of, or more accurately made conscious, the idea that the whole of her work was conceived as a series of metaphors, giving a reality to this return. The question of exile, of life before and after exile, of life in its relationship to exile, would permit her to construct her text from the first page by working the French and English languages in a manner that was even more controlled. The synthetic work that she engaged in led her to place the word exil in French first as a noun, then to push it towards the adjective exilé, exiled, with a first E that without an accent becomes exile in English. Then adding a second E, she makes the adjective feminine and inserts it. But between the two, there is the word île, island in French, which reinforces the sensation of isolation. We therefore read the following words as a formation: exil, exile, île, et. The page that follows these first touches of the noun, name, that which is named, the position of the name. The last is that which settles identity, what happens before the name. Before name, there is none, no name. Without name, a name, no name. The absence of name and the impossibility of naming touches the invoiceable. Without a name, what are we? What do we do? 4 pages further, while 2 diagonals bar the white of the preceding page, bringing to life an additional erasure to which we can refer, Cha writes, quote, no name, no duration, no memory, no reflection, no echo. Everything is suspended in time. Past memories are gathered a little further as reminiscences. She speaks of plural past, which are placed forward towards the front, which advance. These plural passages entail chronologies, also plural, which are trying to make their way to protect themselves from being erased. Several pages follow that could give their content be a resume of the images that parade within Passage Paysage and that will be developed in the film Exilé that Cha produced the same year as writing her text. Images of rooms, particularly, and images of interiors which bump into images of sky. A sky that was crossed at the time of a night flight between the two countries, the one which welcomed, the other left. In the interval, the precision as to name, without name, no name, but faced with filling in a form, name, sex, birthday, birthplace, i.e. the administrative model of the passport, occupies a page in the text. The passport both categorizes and neutralizes, individualizes and imprisons, but paradoxically allows us to travel and to leave one place for another. She wonders, quote, who is being exiled? That is the title, what does? End of quote. Is there what that she evokes the jet, this 16 hours ahead, make it so that the suns can never pass each other and that push back the morning towards unattainable temporal spaces. The time of the voyage, 10 hours and 20 minutes, which are interestingly, consciously or not, renders as 10 hours 22 minuit. 22 minuit, minuit means midnight in French and not minutes. Just a few pages away, she conjugated the tenses in alluding to present active, present passive, present active, present passive. The two sentences modified. She wrote, quote, either both modified sentence before making sentences follow tenses. The sentences to pass from sentences to tenses, which like lightning rods welcome the temporal tensions of the language. Exilé dates from 1980, and this dual work is composed of the simultaneous projection of a film and of a video. This project of the artist includes the memory of her first return to Korea, with the same clean evanescence of form as her preceding videos. The images evoke a meditative silence and immobility. The total length of the work is 50 minutes, and in particular we can see images in it filmed from the plane, as I said, which was taking her to Seoul on her first trips. Images of the sky. This temporality, already mentioned, becomes palpable here in different ways through these filmed images that depend on a two-screen projection and consequently test the means she had long considered as a way to communicate the video image and film image to better display their respective attributes. There again, the principal issue is that of memory and the temporal direction that is absorbed by the one who is remembering. Her Super 8 film doesn't have a soundtrack and is projected at 18 frames per second. This slow speed requires a more attentive participation by the spectator, who thus finds him or herself in a state of weightlessness, in a way similar to that which Cha succeeded in creating with her performances. The video on the monitor next to the projector is also in black and white and begins with a sequence like the beginning of the text. Exilé, described above, sketches the words on the screen, breaking the letters up on images displayed on a dissolve. What we see on the images are actions that themselves break up. For example, an envelope is sprinkled with flour until it is completely covered. When the envelope is removed, it leaves an empty space. This emptiness is an allegory for the memory that which is now absent from the screen. Even though the film is silent, the video broadcasts the voice of the artist saying words in French and in English. In the same process already used in Passage Paysage 2 years before. In the form of an unmatched diptych, Cha has achieved with Exilé a work whose formal and conceptual density is reinforced by the attention required to reframe it visually, which the viewer must do to simultaneously view images that are both complementary and dissociated. It is at the heart of this paradoxical dislocation that both the media for moving images are connected. In Cha writing Exilé, the space between the two E, which, while making the final E float, also permits it to leap out. How many people nowadays live in a language that is not their own? Say Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari in Kafka, What is a Minor Literature, written in 1975. Quote, or still more, don't know their own, or not yet, and know poorly the major language that they are obliged to use. The problem of immigrants, and especially of their children. It starts with end of quote. It starts without me. It started without me, we read in Temps Mort. And Theresa Hak Kyung Cha continues, identity can be retrieved through the reinforcement of identity. Here, the doubling of identity, the double estrangement, asset, invisibility of another tongue, the tongue, now permanently forgotten, would be no shame to have utilized. If end of quote. If Cha wasn't an activist, still her identity expresses her political commitment, her status of exilée, her use of her second language to take her time in settling upon the difference, to go against the tide to better advance, to make that 10-hour flight to arrive on that morning when the time difference make her unreachable from the US. In Temps Mort, in just a few lines, Cha shows the condition of women, particularly the Korean woman, the comfort woman who during the years of the Japanese occupation was condemned to serving the sexual needs of the Japanese army. She was the comfort woman that became a part of the collective unconsciousness, but also in Korean American art and literature, a figure that represented the condition of the Asian woman. 4 decades, these comfort women were silent, keeping this history, their stories secret. It is one of the rare instances where an explicitly sexual question is raised in Cha's work, like the image you have on the screen. With this inset that gives us an acerbic look upon the Korean woman who has been the victim of a history of violence, which is above all a violence of colonization, the artist reveals a feminist political conscience that encompasses the social and political reality of sexual subordination. And we can clearly see direct links with her poetry in Exilé and Temps Mort, what she proposes with her last published work, Dictée. The reception of Cha's literary work, and notably that of Dictée, has gone through multiple analyses and often emphasized the priority of place the artist has awarded to the female face. This book is indeed composed of 9 parts, which represent the 9 Greek muses of the creative arts. From this return to mythology, Cha effects a dual historical task, at once retrospective and introspective, choosing to describe the past of women who were martyrs, but active martyrs, who became martyrs because they had decided to affirm their independence as women. From Joan of Arc, yet again represented by the features of Falconetti in Dreya's film we have seen projected in Other Things Heard, to Yu Guan-soon, a militant in the anti-colonial movements in Korea, and including Saint Teresa of Lisieux, for whom Cha chose a portrait in which she is dressed as Joan of Arc, to the portrait of her mother, of her own mother, Yoon Soon, the women who make up the formal rhizomic structure of this dictée are figures. Their role is to represent themselves as the sides of history of colonization, of displacement, of faith, of violence, of commitment, of love, of passion, and it would be read on the left page. Even though name is still there in dictée, Cha will frame it in nominé, le nom, nominé. She also writes, tell me the story of all those things, beginning wherever you wish, tell even us. If we consider Cha's representations of the Korean woman, we see that stemming from a concern for a narrative of events that were largely unknown for American readers, she has accorded a central place to Yu Gwan-soon, the young Korean revolutionary who was arrested in 1919 while she was at the head of a procession during one of the large anti-colonial demonstrations that occurred during the occupation by the Japanese army. Born in 1902, she wasn't even 17 when she died under the torture she suffered during her arrest and imprisonment. Cha writes, quote, she was stabbed in the chest and subjected to questioning to which she reveals no name, end of quote. When we bring up Yu Gwan-soon, we call her the Korean Joan of Arc. Quote, she calls the name Jeanne d'Arc 3 times, writes Cha, and she continues, there are no people without a nation, no people without ancestry. There are other nations, no matter how small their land, who have their independence. But our country, even with 5,000 years of history, has lost it to the Japanese, end of quote. The history she constructed for her country across a narrative that intermingles Korean and European references reveals its importance to her, is it made with much greater abundance of force than her second return to Korea in 1980, when she found a political situation as tragic as that which forced her family to flee, which she described in dictée through the example of Yu Gwan-soon. She finishes the part which he has dedicated to the young martyr with an undated archival photograph that shows an execution squad and facing death, 3 people dressed in white, blindfolded, to which she has added the following words, face to face with memory. When Cha decided to put down on paper what until that time has been expressed in her work as something allegorical, metaphorical, mental, and conceptual, we realize that her relationship with memory is inseparable from the colonial history, the political history, and the cultural history with which she was confronted. The precise research process as she followed and that she developed in a subjective manner became, as a result, a way to summon up collective memory. This questioning about colonial and post-colonial memory was also for her a possibility to find in art and in film links with her own visual practice and writings. I already told about her interest for Marguerite Duras. She kept in her files an article on Duras, which was published in the August 1981 edition of the Soho News, so when she was already in New York. Amy Tobin had written Cinema is a Woman on the occasion of the first American screening of India's Song in 1975 in the setting of the New York Film Festival. She emphasized something in her analysis of Duras' film, a point upon which Theresa Hak Kyung Cha would have not been indifferent, since she had certainly already begun the project of writing dictée, and since she had just experienced the disillusionment of being unable for the time being to produce her film White Dust of Mongolia because of political tensions in Korea. With a sensitivity that it's important to emphasize, Tobin wrote and about the character Anne-Marie Streeter, who was played by the French actress Delphine Seyrig. Mrs. Streeter has a double, a beggar who for 17 years has followed a road parallel to hers, from the Mekong to Calcutta, where, having passed through all the cities of the Far East, she lives as a half-wit in the garden of the French embassy. You hear her voice, but you never see her. You see the face of European colonialism, but India, impossible to show it. The image and its sound are exiled, one from the other, as the colonizer and the colonized. Colonialism is exile. India's song is at once a personal film and political. The story of Anne-Marie Streeter is inseparable from the story of European colonialism in the period that preceded the Second World War. So through Duras, a means for Cha to grasp the duality of her own colonial history through these exiled images, sounds, and words. It was exactly the moment of the uprising and extreme violence that were disrupting the country when Theresa Hak Kyung Cha returned to Korea with her brother for the first time. South Korea was living a traumatic moment because of a series of events that disrupted the country. The assassination of President Park Chung-hee in October 1979, the coup by General Do Hwan on December 12, 1979, and the uprisings that were violently put down by the police and the army, causing hundreds of deaths. It is the date of May 18, 1980, that remains in memory as the deadliest, and the city of Gwangju, the fourth largest city of South Korea, became the sordid scene of military repression against students and the civilians who joined them in their fight against the junta. During the starting of location that they did for the film project White Dust of Mongolia, both she and her brother were harassed because they were regarded as North Korean spies. White Dust of Mongolia, conceived as a double project in the form of a film and a novel, remains unfinished. In the statement of purpose that she edited for the description of her film, Cha evokes a trip into the past, to the very interior of memory, a memory that materializes physically on the screen. The film projected on the screen is the memory projected, she explains. The film would be the projection of images in a dream from the unconscious. The film starts within the interior of the mind of the character number one, as she begins to see, she begins to remember the latent images memory just before she's completely cured of her amnesia. This duality between lost memory and amnesia means that the person is regarded as somehow lacking. She is without a past. But the ultimate thing missing is that she also lacks speech, and Cha refers to the amnesia of speech. The artist decided to design an anonymous character, and this characteristic that is linked to disappearance and abandonment at the same time paradoxically makes her take on a multitude of identities. She becomes collective, says Cha, a metaphor for every possible identity. Young girl at the movies, waitress squatting on the floor, sales girl on a ferry, orphan, nation, historical condition, mother, memory. By listing in an undifferentiated manner the real possible roles, young girl, servant, orphan, mother, and entities, nation, historical condition, memory, Theresa Hak Kyung Cha accentuates the allegories of this character of infinite facets, which nevertheless all converge towards a form of representation that aims to make simultaneously tangible the processes of remembering and the loss of memory. The treatment that she intended to give her film goes beyond the temporal and linear qualities inherent in the medium of film. She's seeking to print on the film time series that will allow the character to cure her amnesia and to retrieve her memory thanks to the invention of a new system of vocabulary, a new language, an invented language. They teach her her name and many other names. They teach her the events and places of the presumed past, and they literally teach her the alphabet, says Cha. From then on, Cha's idea is to cross the narratives, to multiply the chronologies, to place her subject at the center of intersection of visual methods that permit her to recall these forgotten moments of her history, to make them palpable through memory. The statement which this time refers to her projected novel is presented from a less abstract perspective, choosing to return to the history of a Korea occupied by Japan for 45 years. One point in this history, she considers too little known and acts to expose it, to emphasize it. She recalls a diplomatic conflict linked to relations between Korea, China, Russia, Japan, and the United States. She establishes as well a parallel between the suffering of the Koreans and that of the Vietnamese. In this novel, the main character is to be a young woman, Korean, but living in China. All this visual research led Cha to publish the same year, so 1980, when she is already working on White Dust of Mongolia and on Exilé Temps Mort, an anthology of texts on the cinematic apparatus. Apparatus includes one of her very important work, marked both a poetic process which could be thought as a cinematic cut. The selected writings starts with an essay of Roland Barthes and a quote of Jean-Luc Godard. And these are the pages, some of the pages of the apparatus. And there's also like an essay by Dziga Vertov, and the reference to Dziga Vertov with the image of Anna Karina in a Godard movie goes together, of course, with the Dziga Vertov group Godard created in the early 70s. And these are images from the Godard, like presenting a cinema apparatus, which Cha refers to in her work. How to silence are the words of the commentary that Cha inserted into the heart of her anthology, Apparatus. The thread of language and of writing, as mentioned by Trinh Minh in an essay on Cha published in 2001, is confined to 67 pages that, with the deep black of their border, create a clear visual break when we look at the text block. Comme, comment, commentaire, tier, the section of French words that bump into the English tier, with its double meaning of tier, as into whip and rip, reminds us how often an artist's use of words is built upon a fragile relationship with existence. Comment, translated from French, it means how, but the word comment or comment in English means commentaire in French. As Trinh Minh writes in her essay just mentioned, quote, comment taire? The question raised is not simply how to keep the silence, to stay quiet or to hold one's tongue, but how not to say while saying. How, she continues, if answers are what one wants, can be found anytime, everywhere one cares to look, although they may come one by one to one's limited ear, They show up and take leave by the thousands when the whole of a body listens to life and death. Answers, if answers there are, to the impossible, how, are written, translated, and realized all over Cha's work. End of quote. The poetry that emerges from the words of Trinh Minh Ha goes beyond the terms that she has added to Cha's work, beyond the allegorical interpretation that she decided to use in what she wrote to accompany literally the subjective reading that she has so correctly made of commentaire. Knowledge of French is necessary here again to understand the play of words framed by the artist, although even the term play becomes inadequate once we decide to consider the pages of the work with the seriousness of announcement, white screens framed in black. Commentaire in apparatus is also a way for Cha to place her own writing, conceived in visual terms, as a counterpoint to the rigor of the theoretician from whom she has invited to take part in her anthology. For the parallel present, a contrast, a doubtless, it is as well what the artist thought. Cha's joint use of French and English takes on an additional meaning in the framework of a publication like Apparatus, where the quasi-totality of the reproduced text are translations done for the most part by Bertrand Hoogst, who was a professor at the Department of French at UC Berkeley and a specialist of avant-garde European cinema. He was also a close friend of the major French film theoreticians of the time. Hoogst has 2 essays in the anthology as well. Moreover, most of the texts were published in French or in specialized journals, and Cha has to some extent created her own meaning by placing them together in the anthology in her function as editor of a work in which she pays homage to the authors and filmmakers who were important for her training and her creative universe. Commentaire visually assembles these texts. In addition, the title of Cha's work, this is inscribed within Apparatus, is also paired with what it signifies. A commentary's function is the expression of an argument on a text or work, and by leaving the French word, Cha is explicitly referring to the other essays that are in this language, but also to the scholarly exercise in logic which she has included just afterward with her book Dictée, an exercise which adapts itself to the grid of a meticulous reading as we understand it by studying the raw version of Commentaire found in the archives of the Berkeley Art Museum, a model made of cutout papers and words written in black crayon. We notice when these pages are flat how much the alternative black and white words on black backgrounds or black words on white background are conceived and mounted as film sequences, like an alternation that supports the construction of pages while deconstructing the structure of words. White and black accompany her commentaire, but also her films, her videos, her text, and her photographs that document her performance. This black and white, which is that of the film image and of the book, delineates a space devoid of color, as if to better reinforce the contrast that she seeks to emphasize and the rigor that she tries hard to maintain. However, austerity is not what she is looking for. The black and white that she calls upon, notably that of the cinema, would well be which Marguerite Duras describes when she reminds us the white of black and white, there is no white in color films. True whiteness that are snow, of spray, of white flowers on moonlit nights that is attained only with black and white. This quote was taken from a special edition on Duras of Cahiers du Cinéma in June 1980 called Les Yeux Verts, Green Eyes, and which Theresa Hak Kyung Cha owned in her archives, in her files. I will conclude in silence with these two images of a cinematic apparatus, this of Godard sleeping in numéro 2, and this of Cha working at her editing table. Thank you. I think I was a little bit long, but...
Any questions?
First off, thank you for the talk. I picked up dictate in undergrad and decided I wasn't prepared for the layers of it, so it's great to immerse in her world. This is kind of unformed, but I read today that you also have written on Lorna Simpson, and the two bodies of work seem very disparate, but there seems to be a trauma of selves and selving and identities, and a cultural and historic trauma, and then also a refusal to be silenced by that trauma and refusal to be seen only by these traumatic, reified, stereotypical images. I don't know if you agree or if you want to say any other overlap between the two.
That's interesting. I did not expect to have this like a parallel with Lorna Simpson, but it's interesting. I did not. I actually this is interesting. Thank you for your question. I don't know if how I can answer to that, but it's true that the idea. I mean, Cha's position is a special one, as she was one of the first, I mean, as far as I remember, in the early 70s, like one of the first like artists working with images and text. So it's true that, like Lorna Simpson, she's also working with images and text, and that the text is there to emphasize what the image shows or doesn't show. And sometimes there is some a position where her text become like a mental images. But this question of silence, I think it could be possible to link it in the early Lorna Simpson work in the photographies, but after, when she started to use video, it was not really like something linked on silence, but it's interesting. Actually, it's as I work on, as a contemporary art historian, this experience of doing this research on Cha was the first one on without that I was able to meet the artist. So this was also something. So there is a lot of interpretation, and then it was a completely different way. That's why I tried to stay very close to what I found in her archives, and that all the material, visual, or her notes, and the important, and also all this conceptual, because all the statements I presented, it also everything is typewritten, and then, but she of course did not know that this will be one day, presented or like used as a material for research. Maybe she knew, but maybe not. And then, but it's interesting to see that at that time in conceptual art, you had exactly the same like. Typeface, or of course the typing machine, and everything was. So this is also interesting that all the work for me was this idea of memory. It's also hard to. It is quite rare to have someone working on the idea of memory and like expressing this how you say the concept of memory as a word. And also as an allegory. So, and yeah, I don't know if I answered right.
Thank you for the talk. It was very interesting to be able to actually watch some of the video clips, for example, the mouth one, because I think with her work, many times you see the still images, and it's also, because I was thinking about this while watching it, it's kind of the black and white sort of images, the way that they're reproduced many times. they're so gray, and so when you see it in motion, it's very different, as well as to hear the sound, and so this kind of staticky looking monitor presentation changes. But I thought that thank you very much for the talk and for bringing up so many ways of thinking about the way that the language and the learning of the language and also the idea of the images and the language and the breathing of the images. There were many interesting connections that I don't think have been revealed yet, and I think that your work in the archive, like really digging into it and dealing with the matter of the material is a really refreshing approach to it. I mean, it's very interesting what you mentioned about the the relationship to conceptual work, and that we can note in like the type, for example, the typewriter type, and the time period, but that the emphasis is it has some other resonance. And I was wondering if you could say, if you had any other thoughts you might offer about that.
You mean
about the time period that you're covering? I mean, because it's interesting the way that, okay, the title of the book, Berkeley, 1968, situates a particular moment, and then, but Cha, she's sort of coming of age, well, I mean, a bit later in terms of maturity. And so I'm just curious about the way that it's interesting how you're situating her in relationship to these other
Actually, what was very interesting for me when I started this research was that when you study the work of an artist, you just go through all the time of the education. You have this also, for example, with an artist like Anna Mendieta, when you like all her performances in the time when she was still at the university were like documented. And so what is actually Cha, she starts with having a she's at the art department in Berkeley and at the French department, and both at the same time. So she starts and this is 68. And so I really studied the context of the time in Berkeley, and why I wanted to point on 1968 was the moment when she started her studies, like at UC Berkeley. And Berkeley, and of course, okay, this is also something, it's the first time, of course, I present her work in the US. And then already, I mean, in the US, she is not really well known, but in Europe, she's not known at all. So if I just like put on the title Theresa Hak Kyung Cha, I mean, this will be like a complete like mystery for any French public or like reader. So with pointing on Berkeley and 68, I mean, everybody knows Berkeley because she was in Berkeley. And 1968 has also like a resonance in the context of France. So it was also a way for me to bring her back to a country or in a context where it was really important for her to be involved because she had 6 months in Paris. So it was also the first time in my research that I had the possibility to study the work of an artist who spoke French and then who had experience in Paris. And I did not want to go on too much in her. I mean, I did not meet her family or anybody, but I met like quite a lot of the artists or the people she was involved with and her professors in Paris. So this seems like with the Berkeley and 1968. So what was also like for me, because she had such a short life, And actually, almost everything she has done was when she was a student. So this was something for me very interesting, that while you're like studying as an artist or as in arts or in literature or in any kind of department, at what point do you start to become something else than a student? You know, how far your thoughts, how far your research could bring you to have a kind of intellectual autonomy or artistic autonomy. And I found out that Cha was very young to do a certain kind of things, what the things she was doing, and that she was even before other artists of that time. And so, of course, like with, like in when you consider with like all this feminist, but she was in, but out of everything. So this is also something. She did not belong to any category. She did not belong to any. She was using many mediums. The performance, when what I read in the different reviews, was that the performances were incredible because everybody seems to be like under hypnosis or something, because everybody was quite, and so this was also visually something very different of that moment. Okay, very much linked to what was going on in the performance in the Bay Area. Very different of the East Coast, because the East Coast was very, very something else. But still, she was a real like intellectual because of her references. She was the first one to bring to the US all this French film like theory, which was like something completely, even in France, you did not have in the context of contemporary art, these like junctions between film and film, video, and everything, except with Godard. So this was also interesting that Godard was at Berkeley at that time, and also like Marguerite Duras, whom I quote, or Samuel Beckett, or all these things. It was the first time that I could see you had always like this plurality in the 70s. You had, I don't know, you not long ago you had the chance to listen to Yvonne Rainer. Yvonne Rainer, she was like a choreographer, but she also became a filmmaker, and then she used to live with Robert Morris, who was like telling that he was also a choreographer and that he was also a visual artist, and everything was in this kind of like plurality of several categories together. But Cha was not in several categories together. She was in no category. So this was something which was very interesting for me. And to go back to the context, when it's true that even though when we see her work, there was not a lot of work like this at that time. So this was something which was very interesting for me, but it took me like years to understand in which way I could enter this work and how I could try to. And so at the end, I decided to do it in a kind of personal way or more subjective way in bringing all these references, because each time her references were also mine, was while I was like studying in France, or my own education went through Duras and Foucault and Godard, and so it was like quite interesting. But this context, yes, and also that she was very silent and very quiet. She was never taking part in any kind of like demonstration or something like this, which was at Berkeley in the end of the 60s, which was incredible. She was, yeah.
I just wanted to interject, because that was sort of the line of my questioning as well. One, I wanted to say how much I appreciated the close reading of the work, because I think, at least in the small amount of literature that there has been, there's been very little attention paid to the material culture of the work, which there's clearly a lot going on there in terms of the formal decisions that she made, the conceptual grid-like patterning that she was working with, all of those things. So I really appreciate the the sort of close reading that you gave all of those works. And I guess my question was sort of dovetailing on that conversation, was that question of not only memory, but this idea of her as a interpreter, right? Like you bring up this idea that you're interpreting, it's an interpretive project to begin with because you never spoke to her, or there isn't a kind of a large body of discourse around her, right? And in fact, most of the reception of the work has been dramatically delayed for multiple reasons, even in the US, as you said. Right?
Yes.
And so my question becomes something about her own, the idea that she's not fixed in a category. Nobody's claiming her as this kind of exalted person in a certain mode, right? How do we see her as this interpreter, not only of Godard and the writings of that period that are all happening in 75, that she's clearly in that milieu. You know, so there's something else happening there too with this idea of reception, both in her own work and then how she becomes a kind of mode of reception, I think, for many of these ideas around apparatus and apparatus theory at the time. And I just would want you to tease out for me a little bit more about, or speculate, you did a little bit more about that context, that she wasn't involved in a kind of circle. She was not part of the, like you said, the kind of political protest parties of the period. She does not come to Los Angeles, you know, at that moment either, right, in 75. And so she is this kind of, in this peninsula out there in San Francisco. So I'm just curious a little bit more about who's taking up the work now and this sort of delayed reception, maybe.
Yeah, thank you for your question. It's interesting. Actually, the delayed reception, the main reception of Cha came with her book Dictée. So it was, I think it was interesting that all the comparative literature departments, like that and Asian American Studies department, they started to study Dictée as a kind of post-colonial object, non-identified object. So this in the 90s, yes. So this was in the 90s. So and then and in 92. All her archives were given at the Berkeley Art Museum Pacific Film Archive. So it was 10 years after her death. So it means that it was the moment when the archive were were giving to the museum that the work could be done, you know, in the people, the curators of the Berkeley Art Museum and Pacific Film Archive, which is also quite interesting because the Pacific Film Archive was created on the model of the Cinémathèque Française. So it is also like Henri Langlois, who Jean-Luc Godard writes the letter, came to Berkeley in 1968 or something, and he was giving, like, you know, advice to how to collect the films and everything. So it is also a moment when you have, and so in 92, when the family gives everything to the Berkeley Art Museum, then starts, like, there were like different research. A PhD, which was different, like mass dissertations. 2 or 3 dissertations they started. You know, when you have a new material, it is like possible to work on it. So there was one of a graduate student who grabbed all this material and started to work on it, and then started to publish some essays or text on her. And also in 1993. I mentioned Judith Berry, who was very good friend, close friend with Theresa Hak Kyung Cha, and whom I met in New York, like several years ago when I was still doing the research, and it was 4 years ago. And then she mentioned also all the dynamics around Cha and her, and what they like put together with the work, like having for the first time video in performances, for example, or projection. And in 1993, with other Korean artists, she was invited as a kind of like a commemorative symposium, and at the Whitney Museum. And then there she was presenting Cha's work and all her experience of the 70s. So from that moment on, it was interesting to see that you had the post-colonial part with Dictée, but you had also the interest for feminist practices or women artists in the beginning of the 90s, or mid-90s, all the project in the US, the readers, they were coming between visual arts and feminism. And so Cha started to be included in different feminist exhibitions, like Inside the Visible, I mentioned. This was 1996. So this was also a moment when you have art history, which is constructed through, nobody knows Cha, but and it was always her videos which were presented, of course, because it was something you can have and you can lend and more easily. So I think that I remember having, I was part of a conference several years ago, and then I mentioned, it was in Lausanne in Switzerland, and then I made a comparative reading of Trinh Minh and Theresa Hak Kyung Cha. And it was very interesting to see that, of course, everybody knew Trinh Minh, but nobody knew Theresa Hak Kyung Cha. So it was something and then the way, for example, and I think I will also speak about this tomorrow at the seminar. So, but the way you have in the 70s, or you have artists working, or Trinh Minh, this essay which was published in 2001 in the first catalogue, which was a retrospective, like a survey show at the Berkeley Art Museum, which traveled a little bit in the US, and which also had 2 venues in Europe, one in Vienna and one in Barcelona. So this moment also, like in the early 21st century, was also a moment when you had like another different focus. And so it was, of course, delayed, but there were also different studies on dictée, with both on the postcolonial and feminist approaches. I mean, this because of the woman, because of the Greek mythology and the muses, and then and the figure of her mother and this Korean woman struggling against colonization. So this was something which I think this moment, the mid-90s, with all the different theories, they were reappearing, reappearing in a way after a moment of backlash in the 80s, was quite helpful, let's say, to have another. But it stays very much inscribed linked to this Bay Area. She was not in LA, but she moved to New York. So she married a photographer, and she moved to New York in 1981. And at the moment she was working on White Dust of Mongolia. And then she was, and she had a lot of projects. She was invited at Nova Scotia. She gave seminars, and she had a lot of projects. And so I found also, it was really moving, actually, a lot of letters with her mother. And then when she gives, the schedule of all her plans, and then she was murdered. So this is and also that she produced so many work in such just in a decade. So this is something I think very important to have. What is the way to work when you're a student, and how much but still was being very silent and very slow. So this is something which is
Thank you. I was going to say thanks for sharing all your research, and the first thing that I thought was how does her memory, or the memory that she shows in her art in the United States, was affected by these adjectives of abundance, wealthiness, richness, and what I was answering kind of myself, it was there's a contrast between all these words that are abundant and her small letters and small, getting into more isolation. So I find that interesting. Yeah, I don't know if this, it's kind of a comment, but I don't know if it moves something. And also, why was she murdered, and what are the interpretations of, like, in the art in general, of her being murdered?
Actually, yeah, in the arts, I think, I don't know, at that time they were like, and it was 2 years before Anna Mandietta died, so I think, I don't, like the fact that she was murdered, I don't know exactly, I mean, there are like material in her, like in the archives, but more like all the legal documents about who was the murderer, that he was like kind of a serial rapist or these kind of things. But I have to admit that I was always a little bit, it was a problem for me to, because it was the first time I was working on an artist with whom I cannot have a conversation, that not to because it is very easy. I mean, when you're art historian, it is very easy to just say, okay, this was the reason. I mean, to interpret, to come back, to interpret all a work through what happened at the end. So it is very, like, usually you have art historians say, yeah, she did this kind of work because she may have known that she would be murdered. I don't know. I mean, kind of interpretation. So I tried. I have to say that I try not to think about this very tragic death. And then even when I was going through the archives, I try not to read, like, you know, because you become a little bit voyeur also, you know, about like situations that you don't. And so, it made me always very sad. I'm maybe too sensitive, but it made me always very sad. But you don't have, for example, in the archive, any reviews on, you know, what happened then. There's no article in the all the necrology. You have one or two paper articles, but that's all. You don't have so much things on the fact that she was murdered. I mean, I did not find, and I did not search for it either, actually, but I could maybe go through the, I don't know, New York papers just to see if there is something, but I did not do this research. But yeah, and then, as you said, that it's a comment, but if this idea of is isolation, and I did not want to interpret that either in that way, because it would have been going in a direction I did not want to go, because it's also something that it is often my way to work, which is a little bit strange, but when I discover a work of an artist or of like something I'm interested in, I try to see what what was written and what exists on what was published. And when I see that there is nothing, I say, okay, then I start to do the research, and I'm going to do it myself. So this was also something I wanted to bring, how you say, like to give to reveal something of her work, which could, yeah, like it is for me today. It's like a really great pleasure to be able to speak about her work, because first in France it became like. Little by little, I was also invited after the book was published to speak about her work, and so because of I also made organized a film program in a French Parisian institution, and so her film was 2 or 3 of her videos were bought from the Centre Pompidou, the museum in Paris. So it means that she's now in the public collection in France, so this is like interesting also. So I tried to make, or if I teach a class, I will also include Cha, just to make her more like still alive. I mean, that she's like alive and an artist on whom like other people can also do research and open the field. I think it's important. So. Yeah, her death, I try not to think too much about it, because she would be very young now still. So This is awesome.
I think we're actually going to
yes, it's
to
time.
end, but we will continue tomorrow in the seminar. And thank you all for being here. And thank you, Elvan, for the presentation.
Thank you.